Welcome to Quality Time with MoreSteam. I am your host, Dan Swartout. We have a special show for you today, but before I introduce our guest, I would like you to go back in time with me. Go back to the late 80s or the 90s or even the early 2000s. You and your friends are together, it's a Friday or Saturday, and you and your friends are trying to figure out what to do that night. More often than not, it seemed for almost all of America, those Friday or Saturday nights ended up at Blockbuster. At its peak, there were about 9,000 Blockbuster stores around the world. But almost as quickly as it grew, it was gone. I remember the first time I went to a Blockbuster video store. I was just a kid. It was on Henderson Road here in Columbus, Ohio, and it was amazing to see so many movies in one place. So many new releases, so many movies that I had heard about but haven't had the chance to see yet, and now I had that opportunity. I remember my Blockbuster card. I remember the box that the videos came in. And yes, I remember the late fees. There is so much nostalgia for Blockbuster. If you ask people why they think Blockbuster went away, usually you get a simple answer. Sometimes it's as simple as a one-word answer, Netflix. But the real story of the decline of Blockbuster is more complicated than that. And to tell that story today, our guest is Alan Payne. Alan was one of the most successful franchisees in the history of Blockbuster, and he also wrote the book Built to Fail: The Inside Story of Blockbuster's Inevitable Bust. He really had an inside perspective of the decline of Blockbuster from operating multiple Blockbuster stores for many years. I read Alan's book about a year and a half ago. It's really good. And when we started the podcast, I thought Alan would be a great guest for the show because when I read his book, I recognized a lot of themes and concepts from the world of continuous improvement, from the world of operational excellence, voice of the customer. What happens when you don't respond to voice of the customer? Collecting data, analyzing data, making decisions based on the data that you collect. These are themes and concepts from the world of continuous improvement that come up all the time in Alan's book, and they come up during our discussion here on the podcast. That's why I thought Alan would be a great guest for the show. And beyond that, we're talking about Blockbuster, something that people still remember and talk about and smile about to this day. Before I introduce our guest, Alan Payne, I would like to make you aware of something new and cool at MoreSteam. On April 17th, Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt Kevin Keller presented a webinar on mastering destructive gauge R&R. That webinar is now available to view at moresteam.com. I will put a link to the webinar in the show notes. Be sure to check that out. Really great information on a cool topic, mastering destructive gauge R&R. And now please enjoy my conversation with Alan Payne. I am so lucky to be joined today by Alan Payne. Alan is the author of Built to Fail: The Inside Story of Blockbuster's Inevitable Bust. You can buy this on Amazon. I have read the book. It is a fantastic book. This is truly the inside story of Blockbuster because Alan, not just the author of the book, but also one of the most successful franchisees in Blockbuster for a quarter century. Alan, welcome to the show. I am so glad that you're here to join us today.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
I know when I read the book initially, my thought process, like the thought process of so many people I've talked to since I read your book, you ask the question, what killed Blockbuster? And most people answer really quickly, Netflix. But as I read your book, I learned that that is not the case at all. And we'll dive into that today. But first, I'd like to know, Alan, I'd like to know a little bit about your background that took you from the grocery business to being one of the most successful franchisees in Blockbuster history.
Okay. Well, it starts at a company called HEB, where the company, which if you're not from Texas, you may not be familiar with it, but they're HEB today is a company with about $15 billion in sales and is the dominant grocery company in the state of Texas. Um, they don't operate outside of Texas other than Mexico. They have quite a few stores in Mexico. Um, but I went to work for HEB out of college in 1978. And at the time, HEB was obviously a much smaller company, but it was still one of the better grocery companies in the country today,
Hmm.
as it is today. So I was there for 6 years, and immersed in the retail grocery business when they sent me to graduate level course at University of Southern California uh, for their kind of fast track people. And I went out there for a year and came back, and they put me in charge of operations for this was in 1986. They put me in charge of their video business, which was getting ready to open its first freestanding video store. And to put all
So
the timelines in perspective, there was about 50 Blockbuster stores open at the time.
in 1986, I remember that's when my family got our first VCR. And for younger listeners, one of the things that grocery stores did in the mid 80s is would rent videos. So you would go to the store and you would buy your produce, you'd buy your milk, and you'd rent the newest releases. So you were involved with that before they opened the first freestanding store?
Only from managing stores. Obviously, the stores that I managed had video departments in them.
Uh-huh.
But it's an interesting story. But Block HEB decided that they saw these Blockbuster stores, and HEB was very much in the real estate business, and
Uh-huh.
Blockbuster was trying to lease space from them to open Blockbuster stores in cities like San Antonio and Austin and places like that. And they decided, well, rather than lease the space, we think we'll open one on our own. And they were very much into the video rental business within the grocery stores. In fact, they subcontracted that out to a company called O'Donovision that was owned by Craig O'Donovich, and they bought his company. And he was one of the real pioneers in the video business. And he had this concept of how they could do a freestanding store. HEB agreed, and kind of the rest is history. We opened our first store in 1987 across the street from a Blockbuster and tripled them in business. Uh,
And that store was called Video Central, right?
yes, it was called Video Central.
And then Video Central, what are some of the things you've learned? You open right across from a Blockbuster, you triple them in business. What are some of the things you learned that contributed to your success when you had the biggest name in the industry? Well, maybe not quite at that point, but one of the biggest names in the industry right across the street.
It was all about inventory management and the understanding that the role that price played in video rental. Blockbuster didn't and really never understood the price component, and not necessarily giveaway prices, but prices that were low enough to attract maximum volume. Blockbuster never really understood that, and I think Craig brought that expertise in. He had the other thing that, and it's hard to believe, but back in those days, Blockbuster rented new releases for the same price as old movies.
Right.
And that's it stayed that way until the late '90s, and we may get into that later. But it seems so backwards to us to think that customers would perceive old movies to be worth the same amount as new ones. So we had a tiered pricing system, and we were kind of one of the forerunners of that back in those days. And it just killed Blockbuster because we rented new releases for about the same price they did, but our most of the rest of the inventory in the store was like $1.
Uh-huh.
Theirs was $3. So it was kind of a no-brainer. I mean, why would you go to Blockbuster and pay more for virtually everything? If we could run a store as efficiently as they were, and we think we did. I mean, We were backed up by one of the best retailers in the country.
And not only were you renting the old movies at a lower price than the new releases, you also did things differently to ensure that the new releases were in stock more often. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we did something that Blockbuster would have considered crazy. We rented movies for one day at a time. Uh, the new releases, anyway, not the older movies, but the new
Hmm.
releases we rented for one day at a time. And we would charge about the same price as Blockbuster would. Ours were back in those days, it's probably $3. So we charged $3 a day. They would charge $3 for 3 days. And what we found is that we could stay in stock much, much better than a Blockbuster could on the high demand new releases. And that was much more important to customers than keeping it for 2 or 3 days because almost everybody watched the movie the day that they rented it. And then they brought it back the next day, we could rent it again. So our in-stock conditions on new releases were much, much better than Blockbuster ever could be. And we had a much, much larger inventory of older movies that rented for 5 days than Blockbuster had.
I think you're exactly right. Because if you think of the typical trip to Blockbuster, maybe it's date night. We're going as a couple to pick out a movie to watch that night. We're not going as a couple to pick out the movie to watch tomorrow. It was all part of the ritual of the date night was going to Blockbuster and selecting or going to the
Right,
video store and selecting the movie.
right.
And I think it's interesting to note too that if you're able to rent a new release for just one day at a time, the weekends being the peak times, you can rent it twice that weekend instead of once, right?
Yeah, three-fourths of the business came on Friday and Saturday. So it was critical to stay in stock on Saturday as well as Friday, and that was Blockbuster's biggest weakness. Their in-stock conditions in the new releases on Saturday night were terrible.
Right.
Ours would be much, much better than theirs. And back in those days with movies costing $70, you couldn't stay 100% in stock on all new releases, but ours would be substantially better than Blockbuster's.
I'm glad you brought up the cost of movies at the time because as DVDs proliferated, you could go to the store and buy a DVD for $7 or $8, maybe even less if you're going to a cutout bin at a large retailer. But in the early days of the VCR tapes, movies would cost 70, 80, $90.
Right.
They were not priced for retail sales. So anything I would imagine, it almost was like if you look at the box office results for a movie, you have that huge opening weekend, then the declines.
Right.
And I'd imagine it's the same way for a new release at the video store. You got that huge opening weekends and then kind of a decline. So the more often you can maximize a rental at that cost, that's got to mean a lot, right?
That's exactly right. We called it the deterioration curve, how fast the demand of a title would fall off. It probably didn't fall off quite as fast in the video store as a theater, but it fell off very, very quickly. And most of your rents were going to happen in the first 3 weeks it was out. And in those 3 weeks, a Video Central would get 7 to 10 rents. A Blockbuster would get 4 or 5. If you just do the math of that, you know, we didn't keep it all as profit. We plowed a lot of it back into new release purchases, and where we would have 2 or 300 of a major release, Blockbuster might have 60 or 70 because it didn't make sense for them for the economic the way they ran the business. For it didn't make sense for them to buy more.
So you're at Video Central, you're doing well against the competition. Eventually, you move from Video Central to being a Blockbuster franchisee, from being competition to being part of the large industry leader. How did that happen?
Well, we ran Video Central for 6 years and built it up to 35 stores. Uh, and all the stores are doing about $1 million or more. They were very, very successful and they were very profitable. But I didn't leave by choice. Charles Butt decided to sell the stores,
Okay.
and I it we don't we still to this day because Charles is such a private person. He owns the company outright and still does. Uh,
And that's HEB, right?
it's HEB. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the B stands for Butt, B-U-T-T. So the chairman and CEO of HEB is Charles Butt, and he's still there today.
And
Uh,
I think outside of Texas, most people might know HEB because I do believe there are some arenas that have the HEB name, correct?
yeah, they're the Houston Astros. It's not named for it, but you'll see HEB all over the Minute Maid Park. Same way the San Antonio Spurs, HEB is a major sponsor for the Spurs. So you might have seen their name in national broadcast there.
HEB sells Video Central
Sells
and
Video Central, and it wound up being sold to a company your listeners are probably familiar with, Hollywood Video.
right,
And
probably the largest competitor to Blockbuster in the country,
by
correct?
by far, by far. But they weren't at the time. They only had about they didn't have as many stores as we did at the time. But Mark Waddles, who owned that company, had a plan to take it public, and buying those stores, which were great cash flow generators, helped him take Hollywood public.
Okay.
And then we can get into that in a moment. But I had an option of staying with HEB, going to work for Hollywood Video. But at the time, just out of a coincidence, a Blockbuster franchise contacted me and wanted me to come run their business. So I
Uh-huh.
took that opportunity. And they had stores in the state of Alaska and El Paso, Texas. They had the entire state of Alaska and the city of El Paso, and with 18 stores at the time.
18 stores, you're in charge of this as a Blockbuster franchisee. And so obviously then you take and implement some of the things you learned at Video Central. And now instead of in competition with Blockbuster, you're doing these things for your Blockbuster stores, right?
Right, and we didn't do it right at first because I'd always wondered, kind of what was under the hood at Blockbuster, because obviously they were the big story at the time. And I got there, and before I wanted to institute any of how I thought the business should be run, started studying what they did. And the first thing I realized is their reporting structure was just elementary.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't dig down and really see what was going on in a Blockbuster store. It was, I mean, I hate to say it, but it was a joke that you could not break down where the sales and profits were coming from in the rental departments of a Blockbuster store. Their systems were way behind even what we had at HEB. So so we kind of had to go do all kinds of roundabout ways to calculate numbers and try to figure out what was going on. And within 2 or 3 months, I came to the conclusion that I thought the HEB model would work better. So we flipped it. We basically took those stores and just turned them upside down. We took away the 3-day rental and went to one on new releases,
Mm-hmm.
and dropped the price dramatically in catalog and started increasing the inventories there, and increased all the new release purchases because we could afford to do it. And long story short, those became the fastest growing stores in the entire chain. So very quickly, I discovered that 1-day rental with better availability was superior to 3-day rental with poor availability. And the demand for catalog was infinitely greater than Blockbuster ever imagined. We the rentals of our catalog product, which is basically everything over about a year old,
Mm-hmm.
tripled just almost overnight with the price reduction. So it was really fascinating because everything that we had seen at HEB and the Video Central stores, the moment we made those changes in a Blockbuster store that in some cases have been open several years, the customers reacted the exact way they did at Video Centrals. They rented more new releases, they rented a whole lot more catalog, more customers came to the store. The whole dynamics of the store changed. So that's how we ran our Blockbuster stores for the next 25 years.
What kind of data were you able to learn at Video Central that you weren't able to learn in those initial days at Blockbuster before you flipped the stores around?
The main piece was that, to us, the video rental business was really two separate groups of product. It was the new stuff and the old stuff.
Mhm.
And that sounds elementary, but that's kind of what it was. Now there was a lot of dig down within those groups, but the best example I can give is that in a Blockbuster store, I could not go in and run a report on how many catalog movies they were renting. I couldn't even get an accurate inventory of what it was. I would have to
Wow.
go and sort it by release date to break it out so that we could kind of figure out what it was. They just didn't consider it important to break it down that way because they were treating old movies basically the same as new movies. They were all priced the same, and they didn't look at them differently. They didn't manage it differently. So we had to create our own reporting system to analyze the groups of product that we felt were important to running a video store. We couldn't get it out of the Blockbuster inventory management system.
So you developed this system at the new Blockbuster stores, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but many years down the road, when Blockbuster tried to company-wide revise their inventory reporting and data systems, you offered to give them what you had, right?
Well, it's a little different than that. We pushed for systems, and eventually, and we had some support of other franchisees, and eventually, Blockbuster agreed to to build an inventory management system for franchisees. Now, we were the driving force behind that and put in of the most of the pieces of how it was built. But it was built for the franchise community, and it at long last kind of answered our request for getting the kind of inventory information we needed to run the store the way we thought it needed to be run. So when we achieved that, and Blockbuster built it for us,
Mhm.
they assigned some programmers to us, and we got it built within a year or so, and it was superior to anything that the corporate stores were using. So yeah, that's how it happened. Now I didn't get everything that we wanted. We still had to go around and do some things on our own, but it got the majority.
Nationwide, as you're looking to the mid to late 80s, the video rental market, and stop me if I'm wrong, it was very much, grocery stores like we talked about before, mom and pop type of stores. I remember the video store we first went to is called Magic Castle Video
Yeah.
on Lane Avenue. And then as Blockbuster just has this unprecedented growth, a lot of the other avenues for renting videos go away, and it's mostly focused on these big chain stores, Blockbuster, Hollywood, Family Video.
Mhm.
And so from the outside, there is this appearance of unprecedented growth and success as Blockbuster is expanding across the country. But did that outward appearance of growth and success hide some internal issues that would soon lead to the decline?
Well, I think you have to go back a little bit before that into the early mid '80s when all this really exploded.
Okay.
The business was it was dominated by a bunch of mainly mom and pop movies. There were a few small chains, but none of them ever amounted to much of anything. And but this very fragmented group of a bunch of very small operators had built the business up to a $3 or $4 billion industry nationally.
Even by the mid 80s?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It was a significant business when Blockbuster finally got into it, but it was really spread out among a bunch of very small operators, and it's important to note why that happened. And there was two reasons. Number one, video rental was considered illegal by the video studios until the Supreme Court ruled against it. And I believe it was 1984 or 1985. The video Hollywood studios tried to shut it all down.
Right.
So So in those early days, obviously it was not attracting big money from retailers, who were the ones that should have been doing it, but they weren't because of that. The other thing is that even though it was in those early days, a lot of people didn't think the business would last very long. Uh, Cable television was starting to get into some video on demand stuff, and it was it was thought that that business was going to put the video business out of business pretty quickly. It didn't turn out to happen. You know, what happened was completely different from what people thought. But anyway, it was considered kind of a maverick business that wasn't going to be around for very long. But Wayne Huizinga, who had built Waste Management into the
Mhm.
largest waste company in the country, had left and saw the opportunity of Blockbuster, bought controlling interest of the company, and took it national. He was responsible for bringing video mainstream.
Mhm.
So Wayne was just 100% focused on growth. And although he brought some retailers into the company, none of them had any power. It was Wayne and several of the people he brought from Waste Management, and they were really entrepreneurs. They weren't operators, and admittedly so. Wayne said many times he'd rather build something than to operate it. So all of his focus was on building Blockbuster, and by 1993, he had built it to 3,000 stores from almost nothing in 7 years.
That's
So
amazing.
he was opening over a store a day for 7 years, and, he sold it in 1984 to, not I'm sorry, 1994
Mhm.
to, Viacom, which is a company that's still around, owns Paramount,
Right.
uh, and that was in 1984. He sold it for over $8 billion, and I'm kinda getting around to this very important point. That business was valued in 1994 for at $8.4 billion. 6 years later, when Viacom spun off Summit to the public markets, it was valued at just over 2 billion in 2000. So that is before Netflix is even a major player. Netflix exists in 2000, but is only sending movies through the mail, and they're a really small business at the time. Well,
Mhm.
all that happens in a 6 year period before Netflix is even a by mail juggernaut, and years before streaming even becomes a factor.
Thanks, Alan. We'll be right back after this brief message. MoreSteam is the leading global provider of online training, certifications, and technology for Lean Six Sigma. We work with individuals, universities, and businesses, large and small, to provide proven solutions that are right for them. From interactive training to process improvement software, we are here to help you work as efficiently and effectively as possible. Visit moresteam.com to learn more. And we are back with Alan Payne. I think one of the things that your book, and again, the name of the book is Built to Fail: The Inside Story of Blockbuster's Inevitable Bust. I think one of the interesting things about your book is how things in the 90s and the 2000s before Netflix really were detrimental for the company, such as you make the point that as people go to a video store, they almost want it to be similar to a movie theater experience. I go to get the movies, I go to get my snacks, and that's what I want from a video store. But Blockbuster often tried many times to move into selling other things, right?
Yeah, and we all did it early on. Uh,
Uh-huh.
there, video stores were such high traffic stores because if you think about it, it took a few thousand customers to generate reasonable revenue at $5 or $6 a customer. It was a very high traffic business. So the we all in those early days started looking for what else we can sell. There's got to be
Mhm.
something else we can sell to these people. I was in a very unique position at HEB because we were a grocery company, had a distribution system where we could get just about anything.
Mhm.
So in the 80s, we tested virtually everything in those stores, and quickly found out that you could do only two things in a video store. You could rent movies and you could sell snacks, but that was it. And there was a few things that would come through on an interim basis occasionally, but that was it. We tried food, prepared food, batteries, electronics, uh, everything you can think of. And what it boiled down to is they wanted the similar experience of going to a theater. They
Hmm.
wanted and they wanted candy, popcorn, soda, and the peripheral items like that, and that was it. And from throughout the entirety of the video business, 95% of the sales came from those two things. And we sold videos too, and we get into that too, but that was never a significant part of the business. So that's kind of what it was. And Blockbuster and everybody else that was in the business experimented with getting into all those other businesses. And the shame of it with Blockbuster is that we all learned it in the 80s. Blockbuster went through so many management changes that it's like every new CEO that would come on board had to go try it again because it looked obvious. To somebody that had not been in the business and tried it, everybody thought that, oh, well, we should be able to sell telephones and televisions and things like that, cameras. But it had been tried. And it's
Hmm.
like everybody that came in and took over would say, well, I can do it better. So let's try it again. And there was hundreds of millions of dollars flushed down the drain at Blockbuster from trying all those things that had been tried and failed many, many times before.
In the continuous improvement space, there's a term known as voice of the customer, where you listen to customer feedback and you really pivot your business to meet the needs of those customers. And one of the things I found fascinating about your book was that there was a study commissioned, I believe, by Blockbuster that said that the best thing about renting movies was finding something I have not seen before. And yet, Blockbuster greatly throughout the 90s and into the 2000s diminished those catalog titles, those older titles, while your stores reacted to that and supplied much more of those types of titles, correct? How did that sort of play out between your stores and the typical Blockbuster store? I'm leaving you with a little bit of a cliffhanger because Alan will answer that question in our next episode, part two of my conversation with Alan Payne, who wrote Built to Fail, the inside story of Blockbuster's inevitable bust. There is a link to the book in the show notes, so check that out. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with part two of my conversation with Alan Payne. Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you for listening to Quality Time with MoreSteam. You can email the show at qualitytime@moresteam.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. Also, please go ahead and visit our website, moresteam.com, to learn about the software and tools that can help you solve problems, eliminate waste, and do things better. We'll be back in 2 weeks with part two of my conversation with Alan Payne on Quality Time with MoreSteam. Thanks again.